Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, good. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi. I'm a lecturer in economics here at the Open University. And today we are very happy to welcome Rory Horner with us. He will present an amazing and very actually relevant talk for what we are all experiencing in our daily lives. Rory Horner is, oh, sorry, wait, I have to open up again all the windows that I closed, and I don't know why at the last minute. So I'm sorry for the inconvenience. So I prepared a very small descriptions of Rory professional experiences on this topic. So Rory is a senior lecturer at the Global Development Institute, University of Manchester. Is an economic geographer by training, but his research focuses on globalization, trade and development. So it's a very interdisciplinary approach with a particular interest on South-South trade and the pharmaceutical industry. His field research has focused on India's pharmaceutical industry, both in India and South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. He will present on a paper called Between Globalization and Nationalism, India and the Search for COVID-19 Treatments and Vaccines. So I will give you just few information about the talks. The video is being recorded and will be available on our website soon after, so either today or tomorrow. But if people doesn't want to be featured, can ask question in the Q&A in the chat box and ask to remain anonymous. Please make sure that your microphones is muted, and unless you've been invited to ask a question, please keep the microphone off, otherwise there will be a lot of noises in the background. We also are experiencing some internet issues, so we'll also would ask to keep the video off, I mean your video off during Rory's presentation. Please follow us to be updated on, keep updated on our seminars and activities at our Twitter account, which is at intdev_OU. And what else? The last, yes, Hadi has just shared the address in the chat box. So without further ado, we welcome Rory with us. We are all very interested and keen to listen to his presentation. As we were speaking today before, there is a huge cluster at the OU working on the research on health and pharmaceutical industry. So we really hope that your presentation will be a very inspiring food for thought for all of us. And yeah, thank you very much again. And yeah, the floor is yours. I guess, yeah, I will stop you at around 40-45 minutes. Bye.
Thank you, Lorena. So, and thank you for the invitation to be here virtually with you. It's great, especially as I work in a development studies department, and for a long period of time, the pharmaceutical industry has, in a sense, been a relatively marginal interest in development studies, but Open University is perhaps one of the leading places with some really great research on pharmaceuticals in the global south. So it's a real pleasure to be able to talk about some of this research here today. Lorena, I sent an abstract to in September, and this is a very much a talk about an ongoing situation. So it was involved a little bit of guesswork in terms of what the situation might be in terms of being able to talk about at this point, but I'm going to, in a sense, talk about some of the COVID-19 vaccine and also over the last year or so since the outbreak of the pandemic. I'm going to try to talk about this theme of between globalization and nationalism. And in a sense, we have very different discourses that have emerged around the globalization and nationalism. For some, the pandemic has demonstrated the vulnerabilities and the fragility of globalization, that there is when production is concentrated in particular parts of the world, when export bans are introduced, when there's hoarding by certain countries, many other places are left vulnerable. So in a sense, that the COVID pandemic maybe highlights and signals potentially the end of globalization. But for others, globalization has, in a sense, been the solution. While there's nationalism introduced and nationalist policies introduced to try and hoard, including of personal protective equipment, in the first few months of 2020, to then hoard certain drugs, to then buy up certain vaccines, that actually globalization and global value chains can actually be a solution by the scaling up of production in particular parts of the world and the, in a sense, durability of global value chains. So I'm going to explore within this broad theme. I'm going to focus in particular on India, but and talk first about drugs and then more about vaccines, but also a little bit about, very briefly, about China and Russia too. And this is building on my earlier work on India's pharmaceutical industry, and in recent years on India's pharmaceutical industry in Africa, which is based on field work with, anyway, but this is not necessarily based on, this is based on a year without any field work, as it has been for most people in the last year. So to talk first about for those who are less familiar with the pharmaceutical industry, and many of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world are relatively well known, and at least in the UK, people would have heard of most, if not all of them: Pfizer, Roche, Novartis, Merck, GlaxoSmithKline, and the biggest vaccine manufacturers in the world measured in monetary terms are GlaxoSmithKline, Sanofi, Merck, and Pfizer. But although these are the biggest companies in the world, China and India play incredibly important roles in the pharmaceutical industry. So there is a very simplified value chain here of the pharmaceutical industry, from raw materials to APIs, which are known as active pharmaceutical ingredients, to formulations, and then to distribution and marketing. And the API stage of production of drugs is one where China plays an incredibly central role in the global pharmaceutical industry. There's different estimates, some suggesting 60%, even more, of pharmaceuticals in the world are based on APIs manufactured in China. This is a process which involves various chemical reactions, and it is also quite pollution intensive. And over the last 2 to 3 decades, many pharmaceutical companies in Europe and North America have, in a sense, globalized the supply of their APIs to China. India plays a more prominent role in the formulation stage of the value chain. India is known as the pharmacy of the world for its key role in supplying generic medicines, but it also there's a lot of contract manufacturing for drugs for big pharmaceutical companies as well. This is the formulation stage, involves taking the APIs and other excipients and turning them into a liquid, a tablet, a capsule, formulating them into those common formats in which humans consume medicines, and also there can be veterinary formulations too. And then there's a whole series of stages of distribution and marketing. So a very simple generalization is China is incredibly prominent in the ingredient stage, and India is more prominent in the formulation stage. And India is known as the pharmacy of the world. This is a term that has been coined by access to medicines campaigners, but is also used by the Indian industry and the Indian government to highlight the key role that India plays in supplying generic drugs, not just to the global south, but also to the global north too. In monetary terms, exports of pharmaceuticals from India are approximately 50-50 split between countries we conventionally classify as in the global north and those in the global south. But because the price of those drugs supplied to countries in the global south is so much lower, the volume of exports to the global south is a lot bigger. And India is also the biggest supplier of vaccines in the world. Through Serum Institute of India is a major contributor to that, but not the only company in India who does that. This pharmacy of the world attracted the most sort of global attention outside India initially in the early 2000s, especially in the context of the supply of antiretroviral drugs for people living with HIV/AIDS, when Cipla, one of the biggest 3 pharmaceutical companies in India, announced it would supply a year's supply of antiretrovirals for $300 a year. The prevailing price point at that time had been $10,000 a year. It's now less than $100 a year. So India revolutionized the supply of antiretrovirals, has become a major supplier to the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria, and also supplies directly to many governments for their own public procurement, especially in the global south. So India has a huge presence globally pre-pandemic in pharmaceuticals. I'll now talk a little bit about how the sort of progress of the pandemic, and just to talk first through the drugs and then the vaccines, because this, in a sense, geographic structure of the industry with innovation and innovator companies being based still largely in Europe and North America, but enormous manufacturing capacity in India and China, becomes quite prominent in the pharmaceutical response and in different vulnerabilities and, in a sense, solutions that emerge from different parts of the world. So initially, and it's almost hard to remember this stage now, but at this time last year, the COVID-19 pandemic was very much still framed as a China problem. And all the lockdowns emerged almost exactly a year ago in Wuhan, and there was generally a concern, well, for industries that production is concentrated in China, will there be knock-on effects on the supply chain elsewhere? And this is manifest a big concern in India. India had developed considerable capacity in active pharmaceutical ingredient production over, particularly through the 1970s, 1980s and onwards. And actually that originally starting with some state-owned companies set up, one in collaboration with the Soviet Union, another in collaboration with the US in the 1950s and 60s. But India had significant API capabilities, but India itself has become increasingly reliant on sourcing from China, estimated for about 70% of India's APIs come from China. So once the pandemic breaks out in China, there's this major problem in China. The initial concern in India and elsewhere in the pharmaceutical industry is we have enormous dependence and reliance in this industry on supply from China. What happens if production doesn't continue in China, if production gets cut off from China? And this dependence on China in pharmaceuticals had been, the Trump administration had referred to it as a national security risk before the pandemic, but even dating back to during the time of the Obama administration, there were various government reports in the United States into the extent of the dependence in pharmaceuticals and other health industries on China. So of course, there was huge China skepticism amongst the Trump administration, but this concern about reliance on China predates that, and it also extends beyond the United States. The Indian government had various inquiries itself into its reliance on China in recent years before the pandemic too. Most of these concerns weren't necessarily manifest or realized immediately, because many pharmaceutical companies have 2 to 3 months of stock in place, and in a sense, production was able to continue from China. But this, in a sense, was the initial fear, and there was various media reports which emerged in February and March of last year in India initially about concern that what happens if supply breaks down from China, but also in Europe and the United States, and this sort of fear of the vulnerability of this globalization. And for places that used to have self-sufficiency or greater relative self-sufficiency in pharmaceuticals, such as the United States, such as some countries in Europe, and such as India, there's really, why have we let this globalization happen? We're now in a very vulnerable situation. We need to try and do something about this. So the Indian government is one of the first to actually announce a whole scheme to prioritize the manufacturing of bulk drugs. So thinking back to that simplified pharmaceutical value chain, this is India still being very prominent in formulations, but this is an initiative to promote more manufacturing presence again in the API section, also known as bulk drugs section of the value chain. This announcement coming on the 21st of March. And there's various ways then other countries also emerge as and make these initiatives later, which I'll get to. But after this sort of initial concern about disruption to supply, a lot of attention then, and the global attention is, well, what role can the pharmaceutical industry play in providing solutions to COVID-19? So for drugs, this is looking for treatments that will ameliorate when people are already infected, and later when we get to vaccines that sort of immunize people and protect them against infection. And there's this enormous attention around this drug, hydroxychloroquine, which is a well-known and very long-standing anti-malarial drug, or long used as an anti-malarial drug. This huge attention emerges on this in approximately from the beginning of March last year, and various people touted as a treatment. There was one study from the University of Marseille which suggested it was quite effective at reducing the severe incidence of COVID-19. Then when we think about production of it, enormous attention immediately goes to India, because India supplies, or at that time was producing, about 70% of the world's hydroxychloroquine. And IPCA, produces about 80% of India's production of hydroxychloroquine. Also, Zydus Cadila does too, is the second largest producer in India of this drug. There's since, of course, a lot of debate and various skepticism about exactly how effective hydroxychloroquine is, although, and there was some skepticism at the time. But what happens then is there's, in a sense, enormous pressure, because India is has the capacity to produce most of the world's capacity to produce this drug, and now there is global demand and attention looking to access this drug. So India puts in place a export restriction on hydroxychloroquine on the 25th of March, about two days, I think, after India goes into major nationwide lockdown. And this is at a sense when the sort of panic breaking out everywhere around the world at this point in time. There's export bans on personal protective equipment put in place within the European Union as well, between different countries in Europe. Immediately, once this restriction or prohibition on exports, which even from the very beginning, within 24 hours, there was a clarification that where there was advanced market commitment, as in an agreement within an existing supply chain that certain supply had already been promised for the immediate time to follow, that the export would still be allowed, in a sense that where companies had commitments within their value chains to immediate supply their business partners elsewhere, that they would be allowed to do that, and also an agreement that this would continue to be supplied to certain countries for humanitarian reasons. But of course, global media attention is the pharmacy of the world. The pharmacy of the world has shut its doors, that exports are not being allowed to leave India and to be supplied to other countries. Donald Trump weighs in one of his White House addresses, really challenging Modi and threatening diplomatic retaliation if India restricts the export of hydroxychloroquine. Trump himself was also a bit of an advocate himself for hydroxychloroquine, amongst other things. And very quickly then, India, in a sense, and the Indian government relents on its export ban relatively soon and makes it available. So in some sense, this can be seen as a nationalist attempt to sort of harbor the control of hydroxychloroquine by India. But at the other hand, there's actually, in a sense, the pressures of global value chains and trade retaliation, the interdependence that comes with globalization, in a sense, puts pressure to retract this export ban, because products that India needs in other industries or other forms of retaliation perhaps could have been introduced. A lot of attention then moved to Remdesivir, which is an antiviral drug which is owned by Gilead. And Remdesivir it's distinctive from hydroxychloroquine in that, well, for one, it is under patent, so it's a much more recently introduced drug to the world, and Gilead owns the patent. So this immediately sparks sort of concerns around, is intellectual property going to be a barrier again to access to drugs, like it had been for many years for the case of access to antiretrovirals? One thing that's really noticeable about Remdesivir is there was literally zero production of Remdesivir in the world at the beginning of January 2020. There was no current usage for it seen, but immediately, very early on, Gilead began trials for Remdesivir in Wuhan. By the late March, 5 Chinese companies and the Taiwanese National Health Institute had capacity to produce the drug. Now, it was still under patent by Gilead, but if there was any place in the world, or perhaps outside China, that would be able to, that would reverse engineer and be able to supply this drug, it would be India. Of course, current intellectual property rules mean there is stronger patent protection in place in India over the last 15 years, but countries can still have the right, through the Doha Declaration on Public Health, to issue a compulsory license in the case of a health emergency. And so, perhaps anticipating a compulsory license, Gilead issues a voluntary license and rights to supply to 127 countries to 9 companies, 7 of which are in India. And there had been, as this media report indicates, had been sort of rumors that Indian companies had already been sort of trying to create and reverse engineer Remdesivir already. So in a sense, the Doha Declaration most likely encourages the issuing of these voluntary licenses to Remdesivir. A lot of concerns emerged, particularly in Latin America, because these licenses to these generic companies weren't actually given to include most countries in Latin America from this. So there was still, in a sense, they would be reliant on Gilead. A lot of then debate and global kind of controversy becomes around, well, the US buying up a number of months of supply of Remdesivir at the same time, while access to medicines campaigners are trying to work on and lobby for greater accessibility to Remdesivir. There's also many who are actually quite skeptical about the results that are coming out about Remdesivir from different trials, and that's still the case today. But essentially, from Remdesivir 2, India becomes the place for production, especially if anybody in the global south is to get access to this drug. And Remdesivir has been used and it is being used in India for treatment for COVID-19 as well as elsewhere. One other drug, the final one I'll mention, Dexamethasone, which is more of a anti-inflammatory steroid. India produces about 46% of the global volume of this. Some promising trials came out about this in April or May from the UK. But again, while the world was looking to India for this, India was also relying on China for its API. Zydus Cadila had about 82% of the market share of this drug pre-pandemic. So in all three of these examples, hydroxychloroquine, Remdesivir, and dexamethasone, India is in a sense, well, for hydroxychloroquine and dexamethasone, the biggest producer in the world, and the place where voluntary licenses were issued to for hydroxychloroquine. So any attempt to make COVID-19 drug treatments available to many people in the world, in a sense, had to involve India because of the concentration of production capacity and expertise in generic medicines. While India responded quite early to trying to promote greater local pharmaceutical production, this agenda has really expanded in light of the pandemic in America. Both the Trump administration had various sort of discussions about we're being dangerously over-reliant on a global supply chain. Never again should we rely on the rest of the world for our essential medicines and countermeasures. That's from Peter Navarro, the very famously China skeptic, trade advisor to Trump. But it's not just talk. America announced a $354 million contract to Flow Corp in May, which actually had very little previous involvement in the pharmaceutical industry. And there's an enormous loan from the US International Development Finance Corporation to Kodak, well known for cameras, to produce ingredients for drugs. That announcement was made in late July. So it wasn't just talk. There were some big announcements for investment in supporting greater local production of pharmaceuticals in America, especially in the United States. Sorry, not especially in the United States, but this was especially noticeable about this was that it was actually two companies which had relatively little prior engagement in the pharmaceutical industry. Europe has also talked about needing to overcome this reliance on production of medicines on India and China. And in late November, there was a pharmaceutical strategic plan for Europe, which was released by the European Commission, which aims to create strategic autonomy, is the phrasing in that particular report. Although less major signature announcements, various issues, I think, around coordination of local production for a regional bloc in Europe, as in whose country gets the local production. It's much harder to negotiate than it is for one major country. And what's interesting about this is that the whole issue of greater local pharmaceutical production, which has long been discussed in sub-Saharan Africa, and people at the OU have been really leaders on that research, that now that agenda has actually emerged and become much more prominent in the United States and Europe in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So a development agenda that now is, in a sense, being followed in the global south, now being more prominent in the global north. I'll now talk more about the vaccines. And many of you will have heard various amounts and perhaps be a little bit tired of hearing about different vaccines at this point in time, but just to highlight a few things before moving specifically more to the India case. And what's interesting is Sanofi, Merck, GSK, and Pfizer are the biggest vaccine manufacturers in the world in monetary terms. The Serum Institute of India is in volume terms. Now, Merck has actually announced almost in the last week that it's stopping its COVID-19 vaccine candidate. It wasn't looking promising enough. Sanofi GSK have also had some problems, and Sanofi is actually now going to allocate some of its production capacity to manufacturing some of the Pfizer vaccine. Pfizer is the only one that has WHO emergency use approval yet, and Moderna has also got approval, but Pfizer needs to be stored at minus 70 degrees. Moderna which means it has a lot of constraints in terms of its distribution and ease of distribution in the global south. Moderna is only needs to be stored at minus 20 degrees for longer periods of time, but it's much more expensive than the Pfizer vaccine. So both of these initial leading candidates from innovation in the global north, there's been a lot of question marks about how scalable they are and how accessible they are likely to be in the global south. And a lot of attention then has focused on AstraZeneca, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and Johnson & Johnson and Novavax in terms of their potential accessibility, which I will come back to. This table is actually a snapshot from late June, but many of the vaccine candidates which are now rolled out were, in a sense, the leading candidates back at that early stage. And there's a number of Chinese vaccines which are prominent from the very early frontrunners, partly because they started working on the vaccine so early in China. In terms of access to the vaccine, though, we get, and again, this term vaccine nationalism has been used very prominently in recent months. And the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, has warned quite prominently against it. The United States and a number of European countries put a lot of investment into some of these major big pharmaceutical companies to support their manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines, and to support their research on them and their trials. But at the same time, they then bought many of the initial doses, and there's various figures and studies which show very large percentages of the vaccines developed by these companies allocated for countries which we conventionally classify in the global north. And that sort of whole trend of vaccine nationalism, meaning countries without much vaccine manufacturing capacity, or without being part of a group such as the European Union, which has bought access to it, being left in very vulnerable positions. This map has got an enormous amount of attention. The exact protocol or procedures under how particular countries were classified and the estimates were made are a little bit unclear, but it appeared in The Economist in late December, and it shows most prominently perhaps standing out the whole continent of Africa in either red or orange, being the latest places to access, or where the latest places where coronavirus vaccines are likely to be supplied to. And darkest green is COVID-19 vaccines being widely available by March 22 in United States and most countries in Europe. I think what's also noticeable in this map, though, is it's not necessarily the whole of the global south as conventionally classified, which is colored red. Actually, India, China, Brazil, Argentina, for example, all colored in this lighter green, which according to this chart suggests COVID-19 vaccines being made available only 3 months after they are made available in the highest income countries in the world. So in a sense, this map pointing to a distinction between what we could perhaps crudely classify as high income countries, more middle income countries who have some having their own vaccine manufacturing capacity, and the lowest income countries who have very little or no vaccine manufacturing capacity at all. COVAX is the initiative by CEPI, Gavi, and the World Health Organization to provide vaccines. Initially, this was intended to provide vaccines to countries both in the global north and south, but in a sense, many countries in the global north bypass this by booking bilateral deals directly with vaccine candidates. But this has been, in a sense, the global governance solution to try and overcome vaccine nationalism and to provide vaccines to lower and middle income countries. It attracted more than $2 billion investment in 2020, and it aims to supply 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. As of yet, COVAX has not supplied any vaccines anywhere. To be supplied by COVAX, a vaccine needs WHO emergency qualification approval. And the only vaccine which currently has that approval is Pfizer. And as mentioned, Pfizer has very difficult distribution issues for countries in the global south. So COVAX never really invested much in vaccines from Pfizer. There was an announcement last week or the week before for about 50 million doses, but the volumes are much lower. There's a forecast here just from last week for COVAX's estimated supply for 2021, or targeted / estimate. It's the line's a bit blurry between the two, and showing up to well, this shows kind of how gradually the vaccines and the chart from Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. What's particularly noticeable is Serum Institute of India in the darkest blue, and then light blue is Serum Institute of India's Novavax vaccine, the darker blue being AstraZeneca. Both of these, Serum Institute of India being the biggest vaccine manufacturer in the world in volume terms, India clearly playing a key role in the supply to COVAX. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is also being manufactured by Biological E, a Hyderabad-based firm. It's unclear to me whether Biological E in India is going to supply that vaccine to COVAX, or whether it will come from another Johnson & Johnson facility. Nevertheless, this shows first how central India is likely to be to COVAX, but also how dependent the COVAX mechanism is on the approval of the AstraZeneca, Novavax, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines rather than, for example, Pfizer and Moderna. And who gives that approval? It's the WHO itself. So the WHO is in a very interesting situation here, where it needs to pass its own mechanism to supply vaccines to low and middle income countries to be successful. These vaccines need to pass its own regulatory approval mechanisms, which is expected to happen in the coming weeks. And there's various positions on whether COVAX is effective or not. Cyril Ramaphosa, South African president, and also a leader of the African Union, said, while the COVAX initiative is vital to Africa's response, the African Union is concerned that the COVAX volumes to be released between February and June may not extend beyond the needs of frontline healthcare workers, and may thus not be enough to contain the ever-increasing toll of the pandemic in Africa. Another challenge is the target of 600 million doses from COVAX will cover only about 300 million people across the African continent, which is only about 20% of the population. And so partly this delayed response by COVAX, while vaccines are already being rolled out in Europe and North America, has meant that many middle-income countries have been conducting their own bilateral deals themselves. So more countries with more resources in the global south have now done their own deals with various vaccine manufacturers too. Initially, COVAX was bypassed by the high-income countries, but increasingly by middle-income countries too. Now, a different perspective on COVAX comes from Seth Berkley, the CEO of Gavi, and perhaps sort of trying to put a more optimistic spin in a very challenging context, that historically, from the first dose of vaccine until doses are distributed in many, many countries in the developing world, that will probably be 8 to 10 weeks, which is extraordinary compared to historical timelines. Of course, we would have preferred to have had those doses available simultaneously in developed and developing countries. So if we were to go back to this map, if you were to do this map for access to antiretrovirals for people living with HIV/AIDS, we would probably not be talking about a key in the bottom left of a difference of 1 to 2 years in access to COVID-19 vaccines between different countries in the world. We'd be talking at least a decade, if not more, sometimes 15 to even 20 years, when access to antiretrovirals was widely available in the global north, compared to when it was widely available elsewhere. And that wasn't just access in Africa, that was access in South Asia and many other countries in the global South too. So perhaps progress, if we compare it to that, of course, completely insufficient from any normative perspective about what we would like to see happen now in the context of the pandemic. Before I talk a little bit more about India, it's not just India which is supplying COVID-19 vaccines to low and middle income countries. Russia's Sputnik 5, and obviously Sputnik 5, its own expression of nationalism from Russia, was the first COVID-19 vaccine to be approved anywhere in the world, which it now actually is part of its branding. This label is taken from the Sputnik 5 website. In order to scale it up, Sputnik 5, the Gamaleya Research Center, which has developed this vaccine, has an agreement with Hetero Drugs and some other companies in India. Dr. Reddy's is rumored to be one, to manufacture over 300 million doses of this vaccine in India in 2021. This vaccine actually uses a relatively similar technology to the Oxford AstraZeneca one. It's also the very first and vaccine to be administered in a low-income country or in sub-Saharan Africa, although that was only 23 doses, and that was in Guinea. It's also the first COVID-19 vaccine to be administered in Argentina, and its first approval by a country in the European Union came last week from Hungary, which in a sense seemed to be a bilateral approach by Hungary, feeling like the European Union was being a bit slow to go directly to Sputnik 5 for more vaccines. China is also a big supplier of COVID-19 vaccines, and there's a number of candidates here. Most prominent are Sinopharm and Synovac. Sinopharm approved on December 31st. A lot of the trials, one of the fascinating things about the Chinese COVID-19 vaccines is that the trials had to be globalized, partly because of the relatively more successful control of COVID-19 within China. So the UAE becomes a big site for trials of the Chinese, the Sinopharm vaccine, and other trials are also globalized of the Chinese vaccines to other parts of the world. Egypt and Pakistan all have deals for this and have begun immunization programs with Sinopharm. Synovac is another Chinese vaccine, and there's pictures here of Erdogan from Turkey and also Widodo from Indonesia. I thought it's almost a sort of alternative online or Microsoft Teams or Zoom quiz could be to picture different world leaders and ask who they are and guess which country the vaccine comes from, because it sort of tells a bit of a story about geopolitics in some countries. But both Turkey and Indonesia have begun vaccination programs with CureVac, which is Sinovac's vaccine. Thailand and Philippines are also announced plans to use it. And the first vaccinations in Brazil were through Sinovac, and there was a whole tension in Brazil between different states and state level vaccination initiatives versus Bolsonaro's national attempts. India then, though, is perhaps where obviously a major supplier to COVAX, but also a whole range of candidates being developed. And in a way, we can think of these in two main types. First is in terms of technology transfer of vaccines that are developed elsewhere to be manufactured in India. And the second then is for more locally developed vaccines. And what would be called indigenous vaccines. And AstraZeneca and Novavax vaccines are both being manufactured by the Serum Institute. Biological E is manufacturing Johnson & Johnson, and Hetero Drugs and Dr. Reddy's for Sputnik 5. And in a sense, there's rumors at the moment of talk and media reports in the recent days about Moderna being in talks with Tata Group, which has little background in vaccines, to potentially scale it up. But given that hasn't taken place already, it sort of indicates that that the more likely vaccines to be easily scaled up are already have pretty established deals for a number of months now with major Indian companies. Serum Institute and Biological E having long expertise in vaccine production, Hetero Drugs and Dr. Reddy's moving into that space. The very first deal for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine in terms of technology transfer was with the Serum Institute of India. Rumors of Bill Gates both mediating the Oxford AstraZeneca relationship and also with Serum Institute of India. Serum Institute of India being the biggest supplier to UNICEF of vaccines in the world, estimated that about 60% of the world's children have been vaccinated with a vaccine from Serum Institute of India. Bharat Biotech is also one of the major, is interesting in terms of its other vaccine, which has now had emergency use approval in India and part of the vaccination program, which has started on January 16th. It's been developed within India in partnership with the Indian Council for Medical Research. There was initial controversy around this when there was plans that it might actually be approved in time for Indian Independence Day in the middle of August. Attracted a lot of furore, but still a lot of furore when it was announced to get emergency use approval on January 3rd without completion of phase 3 trials. Nevertheless, various expressions of nationalism, both about Serum Institute's role, but particularly about the role of developing an indigenous vaccine within India, which is now part of India's vaccination program. Just for the last few minutes, there's been enormous attention around who will get access to India's vaccines, and especially given the vaccine nationalism and the buying up of vaccines by richer countries in the global north. There's been continuous statements from Adar Poonawalla, CEO of Serum Institute, and also from various representatives of the Indian government that India's vaccines will be shared with the world. And the commitment to supply the COVAX facility is one of those. And there's also been various statements that Indian vaccines will be supplied within the neighborhood first. What's interesting, particularly at the moment, is the enormous vaccine manufacturing capacity in India means that India has more than enough vaccines that its current distribution system can deal with on a daily basis, according to various media reports. So that there is actually considerable surplus because of the concentration of vaccine manufacturing capacity to share. So vaccines are being shared with other countries in line with the same time being rolled out within India. Vaccine Maitri, Vaccine Friendship, the first COVID-19 vaccines from India were sent this day last week to Malé in the Maldives. This is a statement from Mohammed Nasheed on that. They were very quickly 1 million doses sent to Nepal of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And even though I think Bangladesh was promised to be first, I think it might have been about a day after the Maldives vaccines when Bangladesh gets vaccines from India. And Afghanistan has now talked about getting vaccines from India. This is incredibly noticeable while richer countries have largely, their only real commitment to sharing has been through the COVAX facility, but India is kind of going beyond that and making vaccines available at the same time it is rolling out vaccines domestically. And it's not just extended to within South Asia or to the Maldives. South Africa was announced a couple of weeks ago that it would get 1 million doses by the end of January and another 500,000 doses by February. In the last week, Bolsonaro has thanked Modi and India for the supply of some of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine manufactured in the Serum Institute to Brazil. And then also the African Union has announced a plan for 270 million doses, a lot of which will come from AstraZeneca, Serum Institute, and Johnson & Johnson. So the African Union, in a sense, going for its own procurement too. So any availability of COVID-19 vaccines in the global south is heavily led by either China most prominently, but also Russia and, India most prominently, but also then by Russia and China more recently. So to bring this more to a conclusion after a a relatively more empirical focus, I think we've seen various ways both globalization and nationalism are manifest in this, and both having, in a sense, problematic aspects, but in a way, both also being somewhat part of the solution. So I'm suggesting really that rather than seeing this as kind of the end of globalization or a switch to just nationalism, we're really see various expressions of both globalization and nationalism in the COVID-19 response. In terms of globalization, the scaling up of production has been much more prominent in places such as China and India, in not just in drugs and vaccines, but also in personal protective equipment and other medical goods. So in a sense, globalization being part of the solution. Global value chains also, to some extent, limiting the extent of export bans, because you create this global interdependence. It's very dangerous for one country to ban export of something from it when it too relies on something else from elsewhere. Of course, not all countries have this interdependent relationship. Some are much more asymmetric relationships. Globalization has provided technology transfer and licensing to, for example, Serum Institute and Biological E within India. Of course, that is on particular terms, and the Oxford vaccine has been licensed more widely, but there is still various constraints and many feeling that some of these vaccines should have been licensed more widely. Globalization also manifests in terms of various ways of pharmaceutical and medical diplomacy, mask diplomacy earlier in the year, but more recently a lot of vaccine diplomacy, which Russia, China, and India in particular are playing. Nationalism manifests in export bans on key drugs, in a sense, in hoarding of procurement, this idea of America first or UK first in terms of vaccination before sharing many vaccines with elsewhere, but also national projects to develop capabilities in the pharmaceutical industry, which India has followed a number of decades ago, and China has done, Russia have done, have actually created capabilities to be able to respond, not just domestically, but to supply vaccines elsewhere. Nationalism also manifests in question marks around whether some vaccines have been approved too quickly in some countries. So globalization and nationalism. And final thoughts to conclude would be to suggest in a way that the vaccine is also, Arundhati Roy used this term, that the pandemic is a portal, but that this whole issue of pharmaceuticals and drugs and vaccines is in a sense a portal on global development. COVID-19 clearly spans across global north and south, and many countries in the global north have struggled to respond. China and India are key for all countries in the world in terms of an effective response to coronavirus. The world needs pharmaceuticals from China and India. We see this development agenda emerging around local production, which has been established for a number of years in sub-Saharan Africa, most prominently, now being discussed much more prominently in Europe and North America in light of the vulnerabilities highlighted by COVID-19. The global north, many would say, doing very little to help or assist the global south in terms of access to drugs and vaccines, largely looking after their own problems. The Global Governance Initiative, for many insufficient, but trying to provide a multilateral solution in a very difficult geopolitical context and where many richer countries have looked after themselves. But it's not the global south as a homogeneous vaccine vacuum of absence of vaccines. Many middle-income countries have begun immunization programs. China, Russia, India, and the vaccine capabilities they have are key, and South-South relations are too. But a lot of South-South inequalities emerging with the lowest income countries left behind. So I will just stop there and leave it there. If that was a lot to cover in a short period of time, but really looking forward to discussion. I hope my internet wasn't too bad, because Manchester, we have very different days of the internet is in different moods. So
yeah, no, thank you very much, Rory. That was amazing. I can hear my voice. Maybe can you like briefly mute so that I can gather a couple of questions for you? and then I will switch again the video and my voice, and you will have a round of, you can reply to the round of questions. Yeah, no, amazing work, and so topical at the moment. I can see that there is, so please either you write it in the chat box like Smith already done. Just for Rory, a clarification, is diplomacy in your table under globalization or nationalism? Interesting question. And then, is anyone have any questions? I guess so, because, but yeah, do you want to raise your hands or speak on the mic? Dinar, okay.
Hi Rory, thanks for that really interesting presentation, and especially it's an evolving situation. So whatever you are collecting the data is changing. My question is about the local production, and you talk about the local production in the north. Do you see going forward the supply chains which were there for the north, the global, where in pharmaceuticals as well as vaccines, undergoing a radical change, in where you will find that there will be more countries in the north will be setting up their own manufacturing facilities and having less. Why I'm asking this question, because if you look at what was happening with the Indian pharmaceutical industry, one of the reasons why the development of capabilities happened because their reliance on the markets in the West. And another question is about the local production capability in the south. What you see the agenda is going to be going forward after the pandemic? Because you have been doing the research on local production in Africa and the Indian pharmaceutical role on it. So I guess there will be some rethinking about their own reliance on the supply chains. So I will stop here. I have a few more questions, but I will come back later. Thanks.
Okay, feel free to ask another question, but in the meantime, I will give the floor to Theo.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation. That was very informative. I have a question about that table you presented about the manifestations of globalization and nationalism, because it seems to me that nationalism tends to appear more when it comes to issues of access, whereas of course globalization is much more about developing the actual technologies. Is that correct?
Okay. Great, thanks, Theo. Good question. And Rory, do you want to reply to these two, which seems a little bit like already pretty dense, and then maybe we'll give another round.
Sure. Will I start? I'll start with. Let me start with Dinar, and then I'll move to Smiti and Theo's question, because they're both on globalization and nationalism. So for Dinar, whether pharmaceutical supply chains in the global north will see a radical change. My short answer suspicion would be probably no. I think it's a lot easier to talk in the context of a pandemic around needing to promote greater domestic capabilities of pharmaceuticals, there to be greater resilience of supply chains, greater domestic capabilities. But it would need significant investment for many years in Europe and North America to really do that, and a significant longer term commitment. It is, there have been, of course, one or two announcements in America so far, and Biden's plans for pharmaceutical and medical industries also seem to be to some extent about having greater kind of domestic health security, as it would be termed. But it's a question of to what extent can American industrial policy combat global market forces which have created this sort of global pharmaceutical supply and quite a lot of reliance on China. And like there are trade-offs. So and some of these lessons come from local production in sub-Saharan Africa, where you can have an industrial interest that will be in favor of it, of course, but there may be some health interests. Sometimes there may be benefits from it, but sometimes it may take a number of years for those health interests to materialize. So if that tension between industrial and health interest is one factor, I think there's a difference between Europe and America and India. It's harder for a regional bloc in Europe to do this than it is for America and India, because one large prominent national government it has less of a coordination challenge to do local than Europe does. And partly I'm thinking here about the context of the East African community, where there's been a lot of prominence at the regional level for supporting local production, but different ways that has struggled to translate into the national level, and various feelings within some countries. Well, is there really a benefit to me to have local production? People I've talked to in Uganda, is it really beneficial to them to have local production in Kenya if it's more expensive, or would you rather just get something a bit cheaper from China or India? So similarly in Europe, clearly the UK is unlikely to feel it has greater local production if the drugs are being manufactured in Belgium or in Italy or in Germany. So you have these coordination issues in Europe. So I think in short, it's got a bit longer, but probably it's going to take a lot of investment and a lot of commitment for more time. And I would suspect that America and India might be able to, those would be the most likely countries in the world to do something about this. And a national government can do it easier than a regional bloc. On the local agenda going forward, it's interesting. I mean, the Johnson & Johnson example in South Africa is, fascinating and problematic, and unclear still what way it will come down on in this verdict. But there was an article on vaccine apartheid at the end of December that was getting huge viral attention, and literally talking about how there's a lot of manufacturing of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine going on by Aspen, South Africa, and Africa's largest pharmaceutical company, but no actual guarantee that any of those vaccines would be supplied to South Africa. So even though you have the capacity within the country, there's so much secrecy around these different deals in terms of the technology transfer that is agreed at the moment. So that, in a sense, would be a case where did national capabilities in South Africa really make a difference? Now, it looks like, I think, various pressure, and there's just a lot of uncertainty around all of these deals, and companies seem to be putting restrictions on governments and how much they're allowed to say. I would sincerely hope that some of those vaccines will go to South Africa and elsewhere, but it was really raised a lot of question marks that you can actually have that capacity and potentially it not be, if you're under tech transfer agreements, not actually have much control over supplying it to your own population. But more broadly, clearly countries with capabilities to manufacture vaccines, and they're being done, of course, in the two ways, tech transfer and indigenous development. And Taiwan is developing its own vaccine. Cuba is developing its own vaccine. There's countries that I didn't mention here. This is definitely, those capabilities are clearly paying off at the moment, so long as these vaccines prove effective. The real question is, what do you do with all that capacity in times which are not a pandemic? And you have to make that commercially rewardable and make those companies or governments need to commit enough to invest in that it's viable outside a pandemic. Adar Poonawalla from your neck of the woods has talked frequently about kind of trying to almost build his own global pandemic preparedness facility, all located in Pune, which so one way is you just have a small number of places in the world, and that is the kind of reserve bank for the world of production capacity. There was a fire there last week where unfortunately 5 people lost their lives, and that again though highlights the risk of having production capability. So it's very hard to come down an immediate verdict, but I think clearly capabilities matter, and that's been demonstrated. I'd better move on to anyway, I look forward to talking to you more about the anyway, your thoughts on this as well at some point, and also from Smiti and Theo, because it's when we're here we get questions and people who've worked a lot on pharmaceuticals, including in India and vaccines too. So, Smiti, I think, I mean, yeah, my classification of globalization and nationalism is very crude for, I guess, an initial attempt at a presentation and talk on this. And I think it probably, the kind of whole diplomacy and it's in a way of both, because in Sputnik 5 is an expression of Russian nationalism, but it's also being, in a sense, globalized and providing a global supply of some vaccines to Argentina and elsewhere subsequently. I mean, similarly, a lot of anyway, there's been various expressions of Bharat Biotech and the whole vaccine Maitri and the whole Modi talking about talking about how India's kind of developed self-sufficiency, and this is clearly a major kind of anyway, something to sing about for Indian nationalism. But it is not a kind of nationalism in the form of the UK or the US, where vaccines are essentially, it's vaccinate our own population first before we try and do much else for anybody else. It's really playing out on this way of the long-standing commitment of India and India's South-South win-win relations, diplomatic way as being a leader of the South in supplying vaccines and medicines to other countries in the South, and being the major backer of global governance initiatives, or the Global Fund wouldn't really work in anywhere near the same way if you didn't have India supplying in the same way. So I that's where I was almost like, maybe it's, and I think the world maybe today is globalization and nationalism, rather than shifting from an era of globalization to one of nationalism. This might be more kind of characteristic of the world. But it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts as well at some point. Theo, when it comes to developing the technologies, it's more globalization. I think, but when it comes to access, it's more nationalism. Is that what the question was, I think? So I think, globalization also comes in terms of, for the drugs, it comes in terms of supply chains, in terms of actually delivering and in terms of manufacturing. So it's not just the innovation. I think the manufacturing side, it's more globalized for drugs than for vaccines. And I think, access is, of course, a strong nationalism which is shaping access at the moment. But I do think it's not a homogenous world where all countries are treating the same nationalist approach to access. Norway has stood out a bit in the last 2 weeks in terms of saying rich countries in Europe need to start sharing vaccines now, going above and beyond COVAX. And India and China and Russia are in a way in their own geopolitical game to make friends and do good things, and in the context of the pandemic through their vaccine supply elsewhere, which anyway, that goes back to whether it's a question of those are nationalism or that's globalization. But I think really interesting blurred boundaries between the two. Thank you for the really good questions, though.
Great. Yeah, I think we have one more question from the audience. Antonis, do you want to intervene, Antonis? And I don't know if both Dinar and Theo want to have a follow-up questions or comments on that. So please raise your virtual hands if you need. But yeah, Antonis.
Yes, hello, Adonis. How are you? Greetings from Athens. So, unfortunately, today we have got worse weather than England. So I don't know who is happier. So, hello, beautiful, let's say, discussion and presentation also. I have understood that you focus a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have understood that you focus a lot on the notion of let's say, nationalism and globalization. Another crucial notion, which for me misses in this whole story, is the notion of imperialism. And you haven't noticed a lot about this. Because for me, this could have solved a lot of the problems you have mentioned. For example, inside the imperialist pyramid, you can see a middle-income country which, the same time, could exploit others and the same time is exploited by others. You mentioned a lot about these middle-income countries. So if you put a country in the middle of the pyramid, you have got one above yourself and or more above yourself and more and other below yourself. So I assume that it would be a better idea not only to focus on what we call unequal development, which is very well known, let's say, issue since the 70s, but also we have to focus on what we call uneven development, which is an older notion. For me, this could be better because we can see how, under this way, how countries, let's say, fight one another, and how countries, let's say, express themselves, because we can see huge discrepancies even inside countries. I will mention just one paradigm, the paradigm of Israel. Israel today have got huge jobs. However, if you are not a Palestinian, if you are a Palestinian, it's another story. I assume that many people in our knows more about this and can understand this. So I assume that in your story you have to let's say add this perspective also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonis. And we have a couple of comments in the chat box, so I'm going to read it out loud. So it's Nishant, maybe the doses you give for free is diplomatic nationalism, and those you charge for is diplomatic globalization. And Stuart Paris, I don't know if you want to ask a question, Stuart, but yeah, otherwise, yeah, he needs to leave. Is Dinar having another question? And I just wanted to flag, for the sake of this discussion, I'm sure everybody read it, but yesterday on The Guardian, a letter from, UK academics actually denounced the need, the urge for the government to take these 3 steps. The first one was to generally finance the vaccine distribution in low-income countries and support the distribution in a way that strengthens health system for the long term. Second, to promote the expansion of production capability in the global south. And third, to distribute a significant proportion of our supply to low-income countries. And I was wondering, having this debate of nationalism, which for me, to in a way extends also to the issue of sovereignty and democracy, if we could comment a little bit on that. So yes, Dinar.
I mean, again, this is just a curiosity about the global governance initiative. You know, the one you mentioned about the COVAX. Why I'm surprised that it's facing such a big challenge, because it has financial backing of Gates. It has a powerful institution like WHO and Gavi involved in it, and you expect when all these factors are there. You expect these sort of initiatives to have better responses, and it seems that even with this, it comes to maybe the debate about the nationalism and how it's how it's linked with the global governance initiatives such as the COVAX. Do you see that links, or do you think there is something else at play? Why this sort of initiative is still struggling to satisfy the aims or objectives of it?
Lorena, I'll come back now.
Yes, I think it's yeah. You have enough material.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, really good questions. Let me maybe start with Dinar and then work backwards. So I mean, I think a lot of the assessments of COVAX seem to be, it's partly whether you take a glass half full or a glass half empty, and that was why I partly presented those 2 quotes from Ramaphosa and from Seth Barkley, because one is that whatever it does, it's going to be only vaccinate a small percentage of the population this year, and that's completely insufficient. And the other is, well, if you were to compare this to, for example, HIV/AIDS or what has happened with many other medicines, and which don't get anywhere near as much attention, actually, the gap in access across different parts of the world would be a lot worse. And actually, for COVAX, if these vaccines do get approved, to start supplying by February is really, really quick in historical context. I mean, the COVAX was done in a time when, or developed in a year when America had withdrawn from the WHO. So clearly a kind of greater, more friendlier world for the WHO would be one where the America backs it. It has been backed by, as you say, by Bill Gates. But it really depends on whether. I mean, most multilateral initiatives in the world, it's not really been a very friendly time the last 3-4 years for any kind of global governance initiative like this. It's not to say that this is a sufficient solution, but it is really trying to go in a world where most countries have just taken countries with the resources to do so have so heavily prioritized themselves. But yeah, in terms of, I mean, Israel is definitely kind of leading the world in terms of vaccination, but of course it's a clear, obvious example of the extreme inequalities in terms of who gets access to vaccines and who vaccines are rolled out to and who they aren't. I guess I framed this a bit more in terms of global inequalities and talking about higher income, middle income, and lower income countries. I hadn't thought beforehand of framing it in terms of imperialism. It's really hard to. So there's a whole complaint when countries don't get access to the vaccine that they're being denied access, but then there's also suspicions in some countries when you do get access to the vaccine that somehow this country is using this, giving you access to this vaccine to try and it might be a dodgy vaccine, or it might be trying to wield its power over you. I had this discussion with a friend from Nepal who was immediately suspicious once Nepal got 1 million doses of a vaccine from India. And I was trying to say, well, actually, this is kind of the vaccine, the technology comes from Oxford. It's a pretty decent vaccine. Yeah, the trials haven't been as great as were initially hoped for, but it sort of has, there's decent enough credentials behind this vaccine. I think for Nepal to get 1 million doses of this vaccine now, when it doesn't have any domestic manufacturing capabilities, is probably a good thing. And India didn't necessarily have to do this, so it's probably a good thing. And I do think there's a lot of this is not. I'm not trying to present this as all like different countries are completely trying to take advantage of each other. I think there has been, especially in different South-South relations, aspects of kind of solidarity and aspects of that win-win relationship, which are there at the same time as overlapping these very different positions that different countries have to respond to the situation. I think that is, in a way, a reflection of the broader dynamics within the pharmaceutical industry that the pandemic shows up, that it's not really just about North versus South, but it's also about the different roles of India and China, which are the major suppliers of pharmaceuticals, for example, to most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, well, largely ingredients from China, formulations from India, to finished drugs in Africa. But at the same time, there's an inequality then vis-a-vis local attempts to develop drugs within sub-Saharan Africa. So it's, I guess what I'm trying to point to is these multiple different layers which are involved in this response, and sometimes terms such as vaccine apartheid or vaccine nationalism, as in all rich countries have bought up all the vaccines, nobody elsewhere in the world is getting any vaccines. It clearly overlooks the enormous efforts that have been gone to in a number of countries to develop vaccines, the capabilities that have been developed in recent decades, and the current attempts to share vaccines across countries.
Yes, Great. Thank you very much. I think it's a very articulated analysis because, as you said, I mean, it's really, yeah, away exactly, as we said, of journalistic imperialism. I don't know if Smita wants to comment on that. We have 9 minutes left, so if any one of you wants to ask any further clarification and questions, we can. I'm looking for hands. If not, I will ask a methodological questions. Is it someone that I didn't see?
Oh no, Lorena, I was just going to ask if any of the pharmaceutical experts, Smita or Dina or anybody else has any thoughts on the whole current vaccine situation. It'd be really interesting to hear as well, but I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask questions of other people.
No, of course you are. I mean, it's a seminar. That's the, yes, of course. That's
just because we don't have any time. We don't have any time for a normal follow-up chat afterwards, or we don't. Anyway, that's these virtual seminars.
No drinks, no beer. So yes. So anyone like Tio, Dinar, Smida, if you have any thoughts.
Maureen or
Maureen. I mean, please, Maureen. I can see Maureen on the participant. Yeah, go ahead, Dinar.
I mean, I'm fascinated with what's happening in India in terms of the vaccine wars and how they're using the vaccine exports, or as a tool of soft power. I mean, I'm more curious about from Smita as well to know about what's happening with the vaccines situation in terms of the two vaccines, the Covaxin and the Covishield, which is the serums and the biotechs ones. They have been started. The vaccination in India, but there is a lot of issues with the trust and confidence in one of because of the trials, and it's a bit more the politics around it as well. But also there is a so there are these questions about political economy there as well. But I will again I'm curious to know from Smita as well. But I think Maureen has a hand up, so let's see, and then
yeah, Maureen. Yeah. I saw it. I just wanted to... Maureen?
Sorry, it took me a minute to get to unwhat's it my mic. No, interesting. Actually, I've got a question really. It's about the technology transfer issues, which kind of came up briefly, Rory, but it's kind of hovers over all of this. The vaccine manufacture is tightly related to biology. I'm looking at kind of Dinar here really. And Smita, it's tightly related to being able to do biotech. It's to biological technological platforms in biotech. So really talking about the local production is actually in the vaccine world, talking about the development of where biotech capabilities go next. So I've kind of got two questions, and I'm not sure if it's to you, Rory, or maybe to Dina, really, which is, one is, what are the prospects for that really in African contexts? I mean, I know a lot of people are working on vaccine manufacture possibilities. The other is kind of what happened in Brazil. Supposedly they have biotech capabilities. They're not featuring much in terms of vaccine development. I just wonder where the technological platforms developing in this field are really happening and where they're not.
Do you want to go, Dina, or?
Yeah.
You go first, then I'll follow it up. Yeah.
I was going to say maybe we should have like a half-day informal workshop that we should set up to just have more of a conversation on this. But because Ken Shadlin has been working quite a bit on Brazil with Elise de Fonseca and other people, and I mean definitely in terms of we've been talking and just literally to know what the level of technology transfer is and how it actually works, because it is incredibly different for a vaccine compared to a drug. And there's the whole discussion around the IP waiver that India and South Africa have been suggesting to the WTO. Now, the whole question is, is IP really a significant barrier to spreading global vaccine manufacturing at the moment. The Moderna example seems to indicate that it's not, because Moderna has said it's not enforcing any of its patents, but basically you can't manufacture a vaccine without the cooperation of the patent owner, whereas any half-decent drug company in India or elsewhere can manufacture a drug without the cooperation of the patent owner. So this distinction in technological complexity and different technology does seem to be incredibly important in the response. And I mean, Ken has written a bit about how IP is probably not the same barrier for vaccines for this reason than it was for drugs, but there's then the whole question of capabilities development, which is really important to bear that in mind too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the point was that, you know, the IP may be different, but you can't manufacture the stuff unless you can do biotech. So it's what that takes.
But the interesting thing is, I think Dr. Reddy's and Hetero Drugs are basically moving, they've kind of started to manufacture, this is examples of companies which had no prior capabilities in manufacturing vaccines, which seem to be now committing to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines, and Tata would as well, if that materializes.
I mean, Rory, with the Dr. Reddy's and Hetero, they are doing biosimilars. So what happened was, when they started developing the biosimilar capabilities, they invested a lot in developing the biotech capability. And I think that's where the connection, whereas somebody like Serum started with vaccine first, and then they are trying to go into the biosimilars. So, you know, it's fascinating to see. And I think these are really distinctive capabilities than pharmaceutical production. And some of the Indian firms really struggle with the biosimilars, whereas they've been doing much better with the vaccines. And in terms of, and I think the Brazilian case, which really is surprising for me, because I was speaking with one of my Brazilian collaborators, and he said as a response to the pandemic, actually the industry has shrunk. The pharmaceutical industry in Brazil has shrunk, and they are and that I'm really surprising, because I was expecting it to be, because they have really these technological transfer agreements, and that's how they focus on developing the local capabilities. And I'm basically trying to get a bit more information from the collaborator, saying why is that happen? Why the industry basically strong, rather than taking it as a I don't have any details yet, but I will certainly circulate once I have a bit more information on that. But I was surprised to see the industry in Brazil has shrunk rather than grown as a response.
Brazil is basically relying on tech transfer from elsewhere, rather than, it doesn't have any of its own domestically developed vaccines, does it? As far as I'm aware, I think it has like Oxford AstraZeneca. It has one of the Chinese ones, and it might have another tech transfer as well.
Yeah, I think you're right, Rory, there. Yeah.
All right. So unfortunately, we'll have to stop this conversation, but I think you should definitely organize a workshop to discuss the way forward to this important research. And yeah, so thank you very much, Rory. It's been a pleasure. The video will be recorded, so you will be able to access it. Thanks to everybody, for participating to this very interesting. Oh, actually, Frankton has a last-minute question. Frankton.
It's not a question per se. I just wanted him to comment on something. Can you hear me, Lorena?
Yeah.
I think at some point in time, I think South Africa and India wrote to the World Trade Organization asking for WTO to suspend intellectual property rights related to COVID vaccines. And apparently the UK government and other rich countries blocked that. So I wonder if you could try to sort of tease a bit on that, particularly linking to the nationalism aspect you did talk about. Sorry that I had to come a bit late, but I think it's something worth discussing here.
Thank you, Frankton. Yeah. Quick.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Thanks, Frankton. I mean, I'll try and be quick. Yeah, a quick answer. I mean, that really relates to this discussion just now, Frankton. It does. IP is not the same barrier for vaccines as it is for drugs. it's very hard to reverse engineer a vaccine. You can't reverse engineer a vaccine without the cooperation of the technology owner. So even if there was no IP in place for some of the vaccines, you still wouldn't be able to have companies in the global south, for example, that would suddenly start manufacturing them. They can do that for drugs, and they did do that for HIV/AIDS when there was no significant patent protection in India. But you just can't do that in the same way for vaccines. So in some sense, IP is a factor, but it's nowhere near the major barrier at the moment to why vaccines are not being available. If there are drugs that are found to be more effective, again, of course, it can be a barrier there. But I think that difference between drugs and vaccines is central for this issue.
Okay. Yeah, interesting.
And then there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions some have about whether richer countries are ever going to agree to that. So some would say, well, that's a proposal that is always likely to fail anyway. But whether that's the situation or not, just because it's more because of the precedent that those countries would be worried about, rather than it necessarily transforming the situation at the moment. And so I guess the interesting thing is there's many people who've worked, including Ken, on the benefits of limited patent protection for many years, who are also recognizing that technology transfer and know-how is the biggest barrier at the moment, not IP. And that's increasingly seems to be the recognition.
Yeah, I think Nishant ended with a very hopeful quote. Thank you for the talk. Let's hope we have 16 billion doses really soon free for all of us, whether it's nationalism or globalization. So yeah, we all hope so. Unfortunately, the politics is a little bit more complicated, but yeah. Thanks a lot again, Rory. We actually have next month's seminars is Mida presenting on updating innovation manuals and metrics with lessons for COVID-19 and cancer care. So feel free to join us and continue the discussion. And I thank everybody for your interventions. And there is a feedback form that you might want to fill for us to improve the seminars. And yeah. Enjoy your rest of the afternoon, and bye. Bye, Rory.
Bye, thanks everyone.
Thanks again.
Thank you.